everyone, and welcome to the opening lecture of Spring Interregnum. My name is Emma, and I am the chair of the Interregnum Committee. The purpose of this evening is to look at our theme of readiness from a different perspective and hopefully gain a greater understanding of what it means to be ready. Before we begin, I would like to give you a few reminders. First, this lecture will be followed by a Q&A session. If you have any questions throughout the lecture, please send them in the Q&A box below. Second, to receive credit for this event, you will need to stay until the end of the lecture and fill out the Google form that will be sent in the chat. Without any further ado, it is my honor to welcome Mr. Roger Kimball as our Interregnum lecturer. Mr. Kimball is the editor and publisher of the New Criterion and president and publisher of Encounter Books. Additionally, he regularly contributes to the New Spectator and the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Kimball is best known for his writings on Western culture, higher education, and the fine arts. His many books include The Tenured Radicals, How Politics Has Corrupted Our Higher Education, Experiments Against Reality, The Fate of Culture in the Postmodern Age, and The Rape of the Masters, How Political Correctness Sabotages Art. Additionally, he serves on the Board of Trustees of the Manhattan Institute and works with a number of higher educational institutions, including Ralston College and the William F. Buckley Program at Yale University. Without any further ado, Mr. Kimball, you can go ahead and begin your lecture.
Great. Thank you, Emma. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry I'm not there. But I'm delighted to participate in this year's Interregnum festivities at the King's College. It's an institution that I've long admired. I'm only sorry that we're not meeting in person, but I'm hopeful that our masters in Albany and Washington will soon see fit to absolve us of our habit of subservience that we've had to follow for the last couple of years. In the meantime, given your theme of readiness, I thought we might begin with a famous remark that Hamlet makes. I know you've all just read Hamlet, that Hamlet makes toward the end of Shakespeare's play, just before his final encounter with Laertes. Hamlet admits that he's been plagued by misgivings. Thou wouldst not think how ill all's here about my heart, he tells Horatio, who then urges his friend to forestall the fencing match with Laertes. No, Hamlet says, there is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. In other words, what will be, will be. The readiness, he says, is all. In other words, one must, as the etymology of the word ready suggests, be prepared, be prepared. The admonition to be prepared, to be ready, is a leitmotif in human affairs, and not just in the Boy Scouts, whose motto, of course, it is. It is therefore being human everywhere in Shakespeare. In Julius Caesar, for example, just before the battle at Philippi, Brutus observes to Cassius that there is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves or lose our ventures. I suppose that there is some irony in the fact that for Hamlet and Brutus both, the readiness, the preparation did not lead on to fortune. Still, the advice is good. We do not know how things are going to turn out in life. We can but prepare ourselves to meet the vicissitudes that chance or providence sends our way. That is the point, ultimately, of education. And it is why the names of so many schools are preceded by the word preparatory, the preparatory school. What are they preparing us for? The traditional answer was for life as free men and women. Now that may seem merely quaint in some precincts of our society today, but it is an answer, I think, that stands behind the very idea of liberal education. And that leads me to the governing question of my remarks tonight. What is liberal about a liberal education? The question is simple enough, but it's not, I think, easy to answer. For one thing, really to answer it, you have to know what the word liberal means. But has any word accumulated more conflicting, maybe even contradictory meanings than the word liberal? They coat the word like so many barnacles, repelling comprehension. Deciding, of course, what the word education means is no simple task either. In my experience, the more you think about those simple words, the more elusive their meanings. According to James Madison, liberty and learning belong together. They support each other, Madison said, and their connection supports a free society. In various forms, the nexus between liberty and learning is a very traditional idea, with epistemological and existential as well as political dimensions. Aristotle begins the book we call Metaphysics with the observation that all men by nature desire to know. Aristotle thought that learning frees us from the snares of ignorance, illusion, and mere appearance. Learning, he thought, not only depends upon, but also begets certain freedoms. In the Gospel according to St. John, Jesus said that you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. In the Gospel, the relevant freedom is freedom from sin, but the point can be generalized. Various schools and colleges have adopted the saying as their motto, and it is perhaps also worth noting that the CIA liked the quotation so much that they had it etched into a wall of their headquarters. It's amusing to speculate what the author of that saying would make of this spooky application of his words. Now, the Greek word that the evangelist John uses for truth is aletheia, and I'm going to, since some of our Greek may be a little rusty, I'm going to show you what that word looks like. That's the Greek word aletheia. I hope you all can see that. And here's a transliteration of it. If we can go down, let's see if that's going to work. Maybe it won't work. Well, I guess we're having this technology is not working as well as I'd hoped. Anyway, it's interesting that the word is negative, aletheia. It's etymologically, then it means not forgetful. In Greek mythology, the river Lethe is a fount of forgetfulness. Truth, aletheia, which is cognate with Lethe, is the antidote. It's the antidote to forgetfulness. The alpha privative, that little first letter there, redeems forgetfulness. Memory, on this view, is deeply implicated in the career of truth. So let's come back to the question, what is liberal about a liberal education? Those who've studied Latin know that the word liberal comes from the Latin word liber, free. The original reason that a liberal arts education was so prized was that it promised to free students from the rust of prejudice and the blinkers of presentism, the belief that the present moment is the summit of wisdom and enlightenment, and that accordingly, the past is nothing more than a graveyard of discredited and mostly malignant ideas. Is liberal education still liberal in this sense? Everyone knows George Santayana's observation that he who is ignorant of the past is destined to repeat it. That snare is one reason we value education so highly. We believe that it can help rescue us from making the same mistakes earlier generations had made. But distance traveled is not necessarily progress logged. It was not so long ago that Cardinal Newman's enumeration of the goals of liberal education could have been taken as a motto by the American academic establishment. Newman said that, quote, the chief objects of a university education were a cultivated intellect, a delicate taste, a candid, equitable, dispassionate mind. a noble and courteous bearing in the conduct of life. That educational ambition was quite normal in the 1850s. How about today? How many colleges do you think would subscribe to that list of desiderata? Not many, I think. Or consider the observation made by the philosopher John Searle that, quote, the idea that the curriculum should be converted to any partisan purpose is a perversion of the ideal of the university. The attempt to convert the curriculum into an instrument of social transformation, he said, leftist, rightist, centrist, whatever, is the very opposite of higher education. Until the day before yesterday, I think, Searle's warning was regarded as common sense. Now it is uncommon and highly provocative wisdom. I'm not suggesting that in the past our educational institutions always lived up to the ideal that Newman enunciated, or that they always avoided the perversion against which Professor Searle warned, but they aspired to. Indeed, at least until the mid-1960s, there was robust agreement about the intellectual and moral goals of a liberal arts education, even if those goals seemed difficult to achieve. There was, for example, a shared commitment to the ideal of disinterested scholarship devoted to the preservation and transmission of knowledge, which meant the preservation and transmission of civilization, pursued in a community free from ideological intimidation. If we inevitably fell short of the ideal nevertheless continued to command respect and exert a guiding influence. The truth is that despite widespread concern about the fate of higher education, and despite many and various efforts to call attention to and remedy the situation, the reality is in many ways far graver today than it was in the 1970s and 1980s, when exotic phenomena such as Afrocentrism, post-colonial studies, queer theory, critical legal studies, and the attack on science by anti-humanistic humanists was just beginning to gather steam. And despite the rise of alternative voices here and there, and very much here at the King's College, I'm happy to say, those dominating the discussion at most institutions are committed to discrediting the traditional humanistic ideals of liberal education by injecting politics into the heart of the educational enterprise. Consider the phenomena of multiculturalism and political correctness. I use scare quotes around the word multiculturalism because what generally travels under that name is really a form of monocultural animus directed at the dominant culture. The multiculturalists claim to be fostering a progressive cultural cosmopolitanism distinguished by superior sensitivity to the downtrodden and dispossessed. In fact, they encourage an orgy of self-flagellating liberal guilt as impotent as it is insatiable. Hence, the woke sensitivity of the multiculturalist is an index not of moral refinement, but of moral vacuousness. Multiculturalism is a paralyzing intoxicant. Its thrill centers around the emotion of superior virtue. Its hangover subsists on a diet of ignorance and blighted good intentions. The crucial thing to understand about multiculturalism is that notwithstanding its emancipationist rhetoric, it is not about recognizing genuine cultural diversity or encouraging pluralism. On the contrary, it is about undermining the priority of Western liberal values in our educational system and in our society at large. In essence, as the political scientist Samuel Huntington pointed out, multiculturalism is anti-European civilization. It is, said Huntington, basically an anti-Western ideology. The most ironical aspect of this whole spectacle is that what appears to its adherents as bravely anti-Western is in fact part of the West's long tradition of self-scrutiny. Indeed, Criticism of the West has been a prominent ingredient in the West's self-understanding, at least since Socrates invited his fellow Athenians to debate with him about the nature of the good life. No civilization in history has been as consistently self-critical as the West. In attacking Western civilization, the multiculturalist is also attacking the liberating spirit of self-scrutiny, replacing it with fashionable dogmas of indoctrination. Anti-Americanism occupies such a prominent place on the agenda of the culture wars today, precisely because the traditional values of American identity, articulated by the founders and grounded in a commitment to individual liberty, limited government, and public virtue, are deeply at odds with the radical, de-civilizing tenets of the multiculturalist enterprise of political correctness. A profound ignorance of the milestones of American or any other culture is one predictable result. The statistics have become proverbial. Huntington quotes one poll showing that while 90% of Ivy League students could identify Rosa Parks, only 25% could identify the author of the words government of the people, by the people, for the people. Another survey revealed that 40% of seniors at 55 top colleges could not say within the right half century when the Civil War took place. The erosion of shared memory is such a potent tool of tyranny because it dissolves those links with the past that gives substance to liberty. The founding father, James Wilson, was right when he observed, quote, "Law and liberty cannot rationally become the object of our love unless they first become objects of our knowledge." Again, it's a matter of readiness, of preparation. We must know the past in order to profit from its lessons. It almost goes without saying that the tenured or soon to be tenured radicals, now controlling nearly all of the most prestigious humanities departments in this country, reply that their critics have overstated the case. Really, they say, there is nothing amiss, nothing has happened that need concern parents, trustees, alumni, government or private funding sources. On the issue of enforcing politically correct behavior on campus, for example, they will assure you that the whole thing has been overblown by conservative journalists who do not sufficiently admire multiculturalism and cannot appreciate that the free exchange of ideas must sometimes be curtailed for the higher virtue of protecting the feelings of designated victim groups. And the curriculum, they will say, has not been politicized, it's merely been democratized, opened up to reflect differing needs and standards of groups and ideas hitherto insufficiently represented in the academy. You don't have to be a devotee of the 1619 Project to understand that the aim of such objections is not to enlighten or persuade, but to intimidate and preempt criticism. The truth is that what we are facing today is nothing less than the destruction of the fundamental premises that underline our conception both of liberal education and of a liberal democratic polity. Like what? Well, like respect for rationality and the rights of the individual, like the commitment to the ideals of disinterested criticism and colorblind justice, like the idea of advancement according to merit, not according to sex, race, or ethnic origin. These quintessentially Western ideas are bedrocks of our political as well as our educational system. And they are precisely the ideas that are now under attack by progressive academics and politically correct bureaucrats, intoxicated by the coercive possibilities generated by their self-infatuated embrace of identity politics. Political correctness also fosters an atmosphere of intimidation and encourages slavish moral and intellectual conformity, attacking the very basis for the free exchange of ideas. Even worse, it encourages a kind of intellectual sentimentality that makes it difficult to acknowledge certain unpalatable realities. The reality, for example, that not all cultures, or indeed all individuals, are equal in terms of potential or accomplishment. It insinuates that dreadful lie in the soul that Socrates warned us about in the Republic. Politics, as the late Andrew Breitbart observed, is downstream from culture. In the United States, a primary engine of culture is the educational establishment. Since the 1960s, it has been anything but an ivory tower, that quiet, semi-cloistered redoubt deliberately subsisting at one remove from partisan passions. On the contrary, the educational establishment, and this goes increasingly for primary and secondary education as well as colleges, has incorporated partisan passions as part of its raison d'etre. The chief question, I think, is this: should our institutions of higher education be devoted primarily to the education of citizens, or should they be laboratories for social and political experimentation? Traditionally, a liberal arts education involved both character formation and learning. The goal was to produce men and women who, as Alan Bloom put it, had reflected thoughtfully on the question, what is man in relation to his highest aspirations as opposed to his low and common needs? In recent decades, however, colleges and universities have more and more been home to what Lionel Trilling called the adversary culture of intellectuals. The goal is rejection and repudiation, not reflection. Rejection and repudiation, not reflection. The key issue, I hasten to add, is not partisan politics per se, but rather the subordinating of intellectual life to non-intellectual, that is, political imperatives. Indeed, it is this failure to check the colonization of intellectual life by politics that stands behind and fuels the degradation of liberal education. The issue is less the presence of bad politics than it is the absence of non-politics in the intellectual life of the university. What has happened to the educational establishment cannot be understood apart from its cultural context. The long march through the institutions that the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci recommended, and whose American outlines I tried to chronicle in my book, The Long March, How the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s Changed America. The Age of Aquarius, I wrote there, did not end when the last electric guitar was unplugged at Woodstock. It lives on in our values and habits, in our tastes, pleasures, and aspirations. It lives on especially in our educational and cultural institutions and in the degraded pop culture that permeates our lives like a corrosive fog. We've been seeing the results of this dissemination everywhere, in the media, in corporate boardrooms, where resolutions deploring systemic racism are touted by quivering virtue signaling bureaucrats, throughout the federal government, where workshops on so-called critical race theory catechize government workers about the evils of whiteness and the glories of trans culture, and in our city streets, where in 2020, Antifa and the self-described trained Marxists of Black Lives Matter rampaged across the country under the protection of the First Amendment while endeavoring to destroy the political culture that underwrites such protections. It is a great irony that the free speech movement, which began in 1964 in the tumult of Berkeley University of California at Berkeley, has mutated into something close to its opposite, an anti-free speech movement that approaches opinions with which it disagrees by attempting to cancel them. It is not uncommon on our nation's campuses to find academics decrying academic freedom in the name of a putatively higher virtue. At many institutions, liberal education has mutated into intolerant indoctrination. A similar process of mutation or reversal has been at work throughout so-called liberal institutions of Western society. In corporate boardrooms, as I mentioned, no less than the media, government, bureaucracies, and such cultural institutions as museums. Indeed, the metastasis of illiberal liberalism beyond the protected purlieus of academia is one of the signal cultural deformations of our time. What it tokens is nothing less than the potential eclipse of that robust understanding of liberal society that has informed the self-understanding of the Anglosphere society from the time of Runnymede and the adoption of Magna Carta in 1215. At its core stand the ideals of free speech, religious liberty, and equality before the law. The repudiation of such values and of the value of limited government, which is a political precondition for their thriving, has underwritten the redefinition of liberalism from the championship of freedom to illiberal, politically correct conformity. It is worth noting, I think, that free speech does not exist in isolation. It is part of a constellation of freedoms that includes, for example, freedom of conscience and the freedom implicit in the idea that we are all equal before the law. Those freedoms are, or were, bedrock principles in the modern secular West. But increasingly, they are up for grabs in a situation where dissent from orthodoxy is met not with disagreement, but with efforts at suppression, scapegoating, and ostracism, the entire armory of so-called cancel culture. It is worth noting, too, how many disciples of intolerance begin by proclaiming their allegiance to freedom, only to redefine it out of existence. Freedom of speech is one thing, said one such campaigner, but usage of your freedom should not be to offend others or advocate hate speech or provoke people to violence. Note that little word, but. Freedom of speech is one thing, but what? A common marker in this debate is the phrase hate speech. We're supposed to say yes to free speech, but deplore hate speech. Speech, as one partisan of this milquetoast version of free speech put it, that offends or insults in general. The law has long had statutes against speech that incites violence or imperils public order, gratuitously crying fire in a crowded theater, for example. But the phrase hate speech is like that other item in the lexicon of leftist redress, social justice. It is a weapon masquerading as a moral imperative. The adjective is cognitively empty, but emotionally charged. It injects an intoxicating dose of moral self-righteousness that clouds the head, even as it sets the heart aflutter. Social justice. What is the difference between social justice and just justice? It's a question that the partisans of social justice would do well to ask. The larger issue here, I think, is one that has bedeviled liberal societies ever since there were liberal societies. Namely, that in attempting to create the maximally tolerant society, we also give scope to those who would prefer to create the maximally intolerant society. It's the old Leninist credo in action: demand freedom, toleration, and diversity when out of power. Practice suppression, control, and elimination of opponents when in power. It's a curious phenomenon. Liberalism implies openness to other points of view, even, it would seem, to those points of view whose success would destroy liberalism. Now, extending tolerance to these points of view is a prescription for suicide, but intolerance betrays the fundamental premise of liberalism, namely openness. As Robert Frost once put it, a liberal is someone who is too broad-minded to take his own part in an argument. The escape from this disease of liberalism lies in understanding that tolerance and openness must be limited by positive values if they are not to be vacuous. American democracy, for example, affords its citizens great latitude. But great latitude is not synonymous with the proposition that anything goes. Alan Bloom put it well. The fact, he wrote in the closing of The American Mind, that there have been different opinions about good and bad in different times and places in no way proves that none is true or superior to others. Perhaps this is the place to introduce an asterisk next to the demand for free speech. Because of the attacks on free speech in the name of political correctness, many conservatives have rallied around the banner of free speech, and it's understandable why they would do that. Some have even started colleges dedicated to the value of free speech without saying much more about the educational substance that freedom was meant to pursue. My own conviction is that while academic freedom is a prerequisite for intellectual inquiry, it cannot by itself serve as the end of that inquiry. It's a necessary but not sufficient value. The point is that our society, like every society, is founded on particular positive values. The rule of law, for example, respect for the individual, religious freedom, the separation of church and state. Or think of the robust liberalism practiced by Sir Charles Napier, a British commander in India in the mid-19th century, told that immolating widows on the funeral pyres of their husbands was a cherished local custom. Excuse me, Napier said, my nation also has a custom. When men burn women alive, we hang them and confiscate their property. My carpenters shall therefore erect gibbets on which to hang all concerned when the widow is consumed. Let us all act according to national customs. And you'll be happy to hear that the practice of suttee was soon stamped out in India. Again, the point is that openness, the openness that a liberal society rightly cherishes, is not a vacuous openness to all points of view. It is not value neutral. It is not, indeed, it cannot say yes to all comers, to the Islamo-fascists, for example, who, after all, has his point of view just as much as the soccer mom has hers. Western democracies are rooted in a particular vision of what Aristotle called the good life for man. The question is, do we as a society still have confidence in the animating values of that vision? Do we possess the requisite will to defend them? Or was the French philosopher Jean-Francois Revel right when he said, quote, democratic civilization is the first in history to blame itself because another power is trying to destroy it? I think the jury is still out on that question. How they are answered, how that question is answered will determine the future not only of Western universities, but also of that astonishing spiritual political experiment that is Western democratic liberalism. That liberalism is embodied in the virtues of disinterestedness and impartiality, the unbiased discernment of truth. It is symbolized, for example, by the image of justice adorning our courthouses, blindfolded and holding a scale to declare her allegiance to law, not man. It is implicit in Martin Luther King Jr.'s observation that what matters is not the color of someone's skin, but rather the content of his character. The entire premise of Black Lives Matter is antithetical to the aspirations of equality in King's hopeful sense. Indeed, with its angry codicil asserting that all lives matter is racist and therefore impermissible, the BLM movement is an inversion of King's message, just as it is an affront to the ideal of impartiality on which the rule of law depends. But the attack on that ideal long predates the BLM movement. It is woven deeply into the culture of repudiation that fueled the radicalism of the 1960s and undermined the humanistic tradition that, once upon a time, our universities existed to foster and hand down. The cultural critic Christopher Lasch diagnosed it with great clarity in his posthumously published book, The Revolt of the Elites. Quote, "A misplaced compassion degrades both the victims who are reduced to objects of pity and their would-be benefactors who find it easier to pity their fellow citizens than hold them up to impersonal standards, attainment of which would entitle them to respect." Lash, the old-fashioned liberal that he was, understood that embracing democracy does not entail a debasement of standards. Equality, rightly understood, requires respect for impartial canons of achievement. This insight lay at the heart of Matthew Arnold's great essay, Culture and Anarchy. Culture, as Arnold regarded it, does not try to teach down to the level of inferior classes. It seeks to do away with classes, to make the best that has been thought and said, known in the world, current everywhere. The best that has been thought and said, make it current everywhere. Hence it is, Arnold wrote, that, quote, "the men of culture are the true apostles of equality. The great men of culture are those who have had a passion for diffusing, for making prevail, for carrying from one end of society to the other, the best knowledge, the best ideas of their time." Today, of course, the contention that some ideas are better than others, let alone some deserve to be called the best, is rejected as an elitist crime against diversity. The cult, the ideology of diversity, what we have baptized as identity politics, which represents the systematic rejection of everything connected with impartiality and objective impersonal standards, is the enabling presupposition of the destructive cauldron of racialist obsession in which our society is now marinating. The irony is that our current intolerance is the perverted progeny of the primary liberal value of openness. It used to be, as Alan Bloom noted, that openness was the virtue that permitted us to seek the good by using reason. Now it means accepting everything and denying reason's power. The unrestrained and thoughtless pursuit of openness, he concludes, has rendered openness meaningless. A couple of concluding observations. In his book, The Notes Toward the Definition of Culture, T.S. Eliot noted that culture is the one thing that cannot be deliberately aimed at. It is the product of a variety of more or less harmonious activities, each pursued for its own sake. For its own sake, that one simple idea that is everywhere imperiled today. When we plant a garden, it is bootless to strive directly for camellias. They are the natural product of our care, nature, and time. We can manage that when it comes to agriculture. When we turn our hands to cultura anima, to the cultivation of the soul, we seem to be considerably less successful. Why is that? Well, let me end by noting that the opposite of conservative is not liberal, but ephemeral. Russell Kirk once observed that he was a conservative because he was a liberal, that is, committed to freedom. Kirk's formulation may sound paradoxical, but it touches on a great truth, I think. To be conservative, that means wanting to conserve what is worth preserving from the ravages of time and ideology, evil and stupidity, so that freedom may thrive. In some plump eras, that task is so easy, we can almost forget how necessary it is. At other times, the enemies of civilization transform the task of preserving our culture into a battle for survival. That, I believe, and I say it regretfully, is where we are today. The readiness is all, as Hamlet observed. The question is, will we be ready? Will we be prepared when we are called to join the battle? It's the question that all of us, in one way or another, must be ready to face. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kimball. It was great to hear your thoughts and comments.
Okay.
We have a lot of questions coming in,
Okay.
and just a reminder to send your questions in the Q&A box if you have any. We will do our best to get as many in as possible, but we have a lot of very challenging questions coming up.
Okay.
So the first question we have is multi-parted. So I'm just going to read it all out as they asked it. How would you define multiculturalism, and are multicultural sects, such as queer theorists or Afrofuturists, divorced from Western liberal Americans? Are they a part of the American sphere, or are they a separate entity? And they're referencing a quote from G.K. Chesterton, which says, "Can the politically correct people hate America enough to change it, yet love her enough to think it worth changing?"
Well, multiculturalism, as it's used in the academy today, is really the opposite of multiculturalism as it might have been understood years ago. If an original understanding of multiculturalism was that you seek to understand different cultures and different points of view, that's one thing. But what the multiculturalists today do is, as I was suggesting, I think in my talk, is try to enforce a sort of monocultural, anti-American understanding of the world. And I mean, it really is, they use the word sect. It is kind of like a sect or a cult. It's one of the great ironies that in almost every college campus you go to today, you will find a little plaque someplace announcing their commitment to diversity. This is part of the multicultural project. But if you scratch it a little bit and look behind that proclamation, you'll find that what they mean by diversity is strict intellectual and moral conformity on any contentious topic. There's only one point of view that you're allowed to have about, say, abortion, for example, on many colleges, or any contentious, Donald Trump, any politician. It's a way of enforcing conformity while using the language of diversity. I think I answered all the parts of that question. If I didn't, let me know and I'll come back to it.
Yeah, I think you got everything for that. So then I guess going off of that, how do we balance the negatives of multiculturalism and the loss of Western culture with classically liberal values of free speech and patriotic national identity, given that rotating mass immigration was accepted by the norm as many classical liberals in the pre-Great Society Act?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question part of that observation.
Yeah, so I think they're asking how we balance the more negative aspects of multiculturalism and losing Western culture, when in the past there have been perhaps ideals that have more embraced the multicultural aspect.
Well, I mean, the partisans of open borders, for example, are sharply undermining American society, as America. I'm not sure what the questioner means by until quite recently, we did not have masses of immigration. So if they're saying, well, America's a melting pot, it's always been, we've always welcomed immigrants and so on, that's not really true. There was a sharp criticism of immigration until quite recently, and there was written into law that we would prefer immigrants from certain parts of the world to other parts of the world. Now, I think that in America today, the open borders people have sold out America for the sake of, well, the real truth of the matter is they've sold out America in order to get Democratic voters. That's the truth. but it's well, anyway, I'll stop there. I think I've I mean, if the question is how you're going to balance these things, I think you have to go to the side of the scale where we can affirm our values as Americans, and that has been lost, I think, to a very large extent.
Interesting. Sorry, interesting. So I guess turning more towards the higher educational aspect, this person asks, if multiculturalists are attempting to indoctrinate students, what do you think their end goal is, and why would they do this?
What is their end goal? Well, their end goal, it depends. Different people have different goals, but I think the destruction of traditional American society is at the far end. That's ultimately their goal. But they they're along the way. They want to. I think a lot of the academics who are multiculturalists, they want to seem important, and taking this radical idea is one way to do that. It's a sort of a ticket in many institutions to academic success. So that's the kind of grubby end of it. But there is a larger ideological end that is informed by Marxist ideology. There's a reason that most of these ideologies have a Marxist kind of flavor. I quoted Antonio Gramsci, the person who recommended a long march through the institutions of culture in order to bring about the Marxist revolution that he and his colleagues so favored. And I think that multiculturalism is part of that. So I quoted Samuel Huntington, who said that essentially it is anti-Western civilization. And that, I think, is that has to be borne in mind. It's not an innocent pursuit, but I think a noxious one.
Sorry, going off of that, are there any college courses that you think students should take during their time in higher education that are going to best prepare them for adult life after graduating?
Well, I think that this the privilege of a college education is incredible. You have 4 years where you can just immerse yourself in, as Matthew Arnold put it, the best that's been thought and said in the world. That's an incredible privilege. It seems to me that in order to make the best use of that privilege, you want to bury yourself in the past rather than the ephemeral works of the present. I mean, many colleges now, you'll find courses on rock and roll or movies, and those are all fine, or contemporary novels. I think that it's if you're going to have a serious college education, you should look to the past, look to the various ways that different thinkers and writers and artists and composers thought about the world. And I think it's, in America, I think it's absolutely critical to understand the thought of the founders. You should read the Federalist Papers, you should read the Constitution, you should think about what an incredible intellectual achievement was made by that founding generation when they articulated a new form of sovereignty. Who was going to be sovereign? The people. That was a new idea. And I think these days, many people graduate from college, not having read the Federalist Papers, not having read, the Constitution. And that's a real pity, it seems to me.
Do you think that there is any space for contemporary writings within the college education, or do you think it should be primarily focused through these older readings?
Well, I think, frankly, I think we should look to the past, not to the streets. I have nothing against reading contemporary novels or going to contemporary movies or all that. That's terrific. Do you want to, many colleges these days costs, $60, $70, $80,000. Do you want to spend your money reading the latest pop novel, or would it be better spent reading Dante or Aristotle? I think that it's a college education is an invitation to have a discussion with all of these people who have made us who we are. Plutarch or Aristotle, or they're not dim, distant people whose existence is only on a dusty shelf. They speak, very directly to who we are as human beings, and it just seems to me that it's a matter of practicality, really. Why should you devote yourself to contemporary works, which you can read anyway, and which are easy to read, when you can benefit from your teachers and your fellow students together reading challenging works from the past? It seems to me that you owe it to yourself to acquaint yourself as much as you can with those thoughts, those writings, those works of culture that made us who we are.
I guess tying this a bit more into King's, because we are a Christian school, we obviously do have different courses on religious studies. How do you see texts like the Bible tying into this philosophy?
Well, I mean, the Bible is absolutely critical. You don't have to be religious to understand that the Bible is foundational to Western civilization, and especially the King James translation. The rhythms, the language of that great translation is everywhere, and it's like Shakespeare in that respect. It's you can't really understand much of our society even today without understanding the Bible. And it seems to me that the Bible would certainly be critical to education as I understand it, higher education as I understand it.
Yeah. So then this student asks, is liberalism truly compatible with Christianity, given it undercuts and contradicts a Christian anthropology? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it depends on, it's part of the problem. I said, liberalism is a word that had accumulated all these different meanings, and sometimes conflicting, almost contradictory meanings. And I think that liberalism understood in one way is completely compatible with Christianity. It doesn't undercut it. That's why there's a kind of liberalism, it seems to me, implicit in that quotation from the Gospel of St. John: "You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And that freedom is, I think, compatible with liberalism rightly understood. But liberalism understood as a kind of ideology, as a kind of vacuous openness, the questioner is absolutely right. It has to be informed by particular positive values in order to be, it seems to me, compatible not only with Christianity, but also compatible with a well-rounded view of what a human being is. And the problem is that we live in a society now where we have a kind of degenerate liberalism, and that's a big problem.
This student asks, is it possible to have an apolitical education in the 21st century America, since approaching ideas from an unbiased perspective have now been very politicized?
Is it possible to have can you just repeat that first bit?
An apolitical education.
Well, I think so. It's possible. Possibility is cheap, of course. We all have our points of view. We come to every question, with our own history, our own prejudices, and so on. But yes, that's the ideal of disinterestedness. That is absolutely critical to a liberal education, rightly understood, I think. And there are a handful, maybe not more than a handful. There are a handful of colleges where that's the goal. That's the way things are pursued. And it doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean that you don't have your own particular point of view, but to educate is the German word Bildung. It's the idea is that it lifts you out of your particular limited, narrow point of view as an individual and exposes you to world culture, and that's a very positive thing, it seems to me. So I think it's possible. I think that it's not being practiced or pursued at many, maybe most colleges and universities, which is a great pity, and especially the most famous ones, the Yales, the Harvards, the Princetons. They're hotbeds of curiously enough, of anti-humanistic humanities departments. So they have really, I think, done a very bad thing to their students. I mean, of course, the technical side, there's the sciences and so on, it's not so bad, but it's the humanities departments are really in trouble because they are biased.
Now, you do work with Yale a bit with the William F. Buckley Jr. program. How do you see yourself pushing towards this unbiased education and fostering a safe culture to share ideas?
No. Well, the Buckley program is a totally separate entity. It was started by a student there who has since graduated, and she is the executive director. And it is its intended purpose is to foster open debate and preserve the intellectual and moral legacy of William F. Buckley Jr. So it's highly critical of Yale in many ways. So, for example, a couple of years, well, I guess several years ago now, there was an incident at one of the colleges in Yale, at Silliman College. There was a student sort of started ranting against the master of they're no longer called master now, they're called head of college. I forget even what the occasion was, but somebody took a video of this and it went viral because this lady was screaming at this person. And the Buckley program publicized this. I wrote about it for the Wall Street Journal, and I think it embarrassed Yale to have this publicity. So the Buckley program is pretty highly critical of Yale University.
Fascinating. Okay, kind of backtracking with some questions here. One question we have from a student is both sides of the political spectrum, especially in the media, are apt to cancel each other, but this does not solve any issues. It just seems to frustrate. How would you best suggest we live in harmony with people who disagree with us?
Well, I think that the animus is coming primarily from one side, it seems to me. Most large, prestigious institutions, the media, the university, Hollywood, they have a particular political coloration. And they're very left-wing, and they're very intolerant. So I think that from that point of view, we need to have the courage to stand up and expose this when it happens, when somebody's canceled. I think that we want to use the entire armory, the entire rhetorical armory that's available to us. We can ridicule it, we can argue with it, we can satirize it. so the harmony that the questioner is seeking, I think can only be achieved if you are dealing with somebody who is willing to meet you on sort of the level playing field. David Hume, the philosopher, once said that there's no point in arguing with somebody who's not a candid reasoner, an honest reasoner. Well, I think that's true. I think there's many situations where what is required is exposure and often ridicule, and that's part of what we try to do at the New Criterion. We really try to do two things. There's a polemical side where we try to call attention to the emperor's lack of clothes, and the other side is we sort of try to battle what I call cultural amnesia. We try to make available in a way that's serious but not academic, the treasures of the past. So you'll be as likely to find an article about Dante or Shakespeare or Aristotle in the New Criterion as you are a review of the latest play on Broadway. And it seems to me that the harmony that the questioner seeks can only be achieved if people are willing to meet you halfway. And I think there's so many instances in our culture where that's not the case, where the imperatives of cancel culture are extremely pernicious, and they brook no dissent. So I think the opposition to cancel culture has to be pretty robust, and that's something that we try to pursue both at the New Criterion, at Encounter Books, and elsewhere. It's a big problem, because what cancel culture does is it makes any free discussion almost impossible. And I think we need to do what we can to overturn that. And it's sometimes arguments are important, other times satire is important. But as I say, I think we want to avail ourselves of the entire armory of rhetorical weapons to combat it.
As a follow-up to that, how would you suggest we meet people on a level playing field? What similarities or things can we find in common that we might agree on and be able to?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that depends. I don't think there's a formula that could be given for it, but I do think that you have to appeal to people's common interests. So, what is the common interest that's going to be achieved by somebody who says you don't have the right to express an opinion, whatever, some contentious opinion? Well, if they stick to that, it's pretty difficult to see how you can have much of a discussion. If, however, you can find something that you have in common, then that can create a little opening where you can see, well, we maybe you have some passion in common. You might both like to fish or ski or play chess or whatever, and those kind of shared activities can provide an opening to harmony. But the level of intolerance in our society is so high now that I think achieving that harmony with many people is very difficult.
Yeah, I think especially with social media and just not being able to know people as personally, that is definitely a struggle to find a lot of the time.
Yes, I agree.
So moving on from that, why should America be at the center of our conversations around politics and culture? Are there values in the views of other cultures, and how would we reconcile those two things?
Right. Well, of course, there are values in other cultures. but why should we put America at the center of our interest? Because we're Americans. And as I say, the extraordinary, we are so lucky to have had that founding generation. They were very smart people. And there's a reason that America is a magnet. Why do people want to come here? Well, it's freedom, economic opportunity, lots of things like that. And I think, just as Frenchmen should have France at the center of their interests. The English should have England at the center of their interests. But we're Americans. We live in this country, so I think we should understand what it is that how this country was formed, what principles it's based on, and it's because we're Americans, we should put America first, if I may quote a recent politician.
Yeah, America is, of course, like a cultural melting pot. We have developed a lot over time, and I think our culture has changed a lot too. Do you think there is a space to recognize our past heritage and celebrate the places we came from previously?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I don't see those in tension at all. But I think we want to celebrate also our Americanness. But if you happen to come from Slovenia or whatever, that's terrific. Of course you should be proud of your heritage, but also celebrate your adopted country if you have just come from some other place. I don't see those in tension at all.
Okay, great. Then the next question we have, why should we prioritize old works over the labors of current day academics? Is there a way to bring both past and present academia together? And perhaps what are some literary suggestions you might have to bring these two together?
Yeah. Well, again, I think that I quoted Aristotle, all men by nature desire to know. And I think that a healthy intellectual appetite, sure, you want to know what's going on in the world today. But if you're talking about a college education, this I think is 4 unrepeatable years that I think you should prioritize the past. It doesn't mean you can't read the latest novel or go see movies and so on, participate in the life of culture generally. But I don't think you're getting your money's worth if you leave the past as a sort of closed book. It seems to me that it's much harder to read the Critique of Pure Reason than it is the latest selection by the Oprah Winfrey Book Club. And if you're in college, you should take that seriously and try to understand the kind of this process that has led us to where we are now. There's a kind of mankind's adventures in time, you might say, and there's what we want to do is battle parochialness, and the best way to do that, it seems to me, is to acquaint yourself with these very smart people from the past who have thought about the critical questions of what it means to be human, what it means to live a good life, and how Aristotle's notions very different from, say, Nietzsche's, very different, both of them, from St. Augustine. But it's useful to look at all different points of view and try to understand them. And it seems to me that you're selling yourself short if you use college as a way of just acquainting yourself with the latest productions of contemporary culture.
Then I guess one student asks, regarding readiness, how do we prepare ourselves to best influence our surroundings once graduated? I would assume part of that is going to be study of the past, but do you have any other suggestions to that?
Well, I think you want to study the past. You want to understand the political battles that have gone on in the past that continue to resonate in our own culture. I think it's very important to learn how to express yourself as clearly and as thoughtfully as possible. So I think that learning how to write effectively is very important. Learning how to speak in public is an important aspect of education. It used to be that education focused a lot on things like rhetoric. They don't do that so much anymore in most places, and that's a pity, because I think that is a very good way of making oneself ready for adult life, which is learning how to express yourself clearly, thoughtfully, and economically.
Then going back to the study of these past ideas, one student was wondering how that would tie into more contemporary majors, such as a film major, or maybe perhaps a business major, where the study of the past is not going to be as applicable to the degree.
Well, yeah. So when I talk about liberal education, I'm concerned mostly with the humanities. And there are many majors in colleges today that are, only distantly involved in the humanistic study of mankind. So that kind of education is really more vocational, it seems to me. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think probably too many people go to college. I think there probably should be more people who are going to, frankly, vocational schools. We need more plumbers, more electricians. The problem is how you remove the stigma that can attach to that sort of pursuit, because most parents want their kid to go to a 4-year, liberal arts college. Maybe they want them to study law or medicine, but they want that degree. It's a sort of a credentializing experience. And what I was talking about in this talk, it really addresses institutions like the King's College or Hillsdale or Harvard, Yale, all of those schools as well, where they claim to be interested in a liberal arts education, but in many cases they don't live up to that. And the question is, what can you do to recapture the spirit of a liberal arts education? And that's really that's the kind of readiness, it seems to me, that we want to pursue. And many institutions don't do it. I'm happy to know that the King's College does do it.
Yes, we love our liberal arts education. We do have some business majors too, and people wanting to study film, but of course it's all foundational with the liberal arts studies.
Mm-hmm.
The next question we have, they said, you have mentioned the study of history and rhetorical weaponry. Does intellectual humility hold value for readiness?
Absolutely. One of the great things about studying these ideas is that very quickly dissuades you from any pretensions to omniscience that you might have. I mean, education is in part education in this sense is in part sort of a school for learning to be humble, because you quickly learn that there's much that you do not know. And that kind of humility is a very precious achievement. It may sound odd, but I think it's true. And one of the things that you find with the less people know, the more likely they are to be arrogant. And I think that one of the great virtues of a liberal arts education is the humility that it teaches.
Great. Then I think this is going to be our final question for this evening. But this student asks about the kinds of courses in the fine arts and culture that could help students develop their aesthetic appreciation.
Mhm.
What would you suggest for that?
Well, again, I think that it's, I quoted T.S. Eliot about pursuing things for their own sake. And I think that that is absolutely critical. If you're talking about the visual arts, it seems to me that what you want to do is experience things firsthand. And you go to museums and look at the great works of the past and really study them, memorize some paintings, learn about the history of art. It's fascinating. I mean, it's quite interesting actually that the extent to which we have kind of given up on beauty and why that is. What is it that, it used to be that if you were writing a book about art, terms like the beautiful and the sublime you'd see that. At some point, those terms, they kind of got shelved, and then people began talking about art as being, well, it's interesting, and sort of the intrusion of that kind of sentiment into our understanding of art really changed it in a profound way. And it seems, beauty, we might think of beauty as being, it's not the merely pretty. You think of something like Dostoevsky's observation in the Brothers Karamazov. He says, beauty is the battlefield on which God and the devil war for the soul of man. So beauty in that sense is something, profoundly different from the merely pretty. And it seems to me that there's a lot to be said for trying to recapture some older ideas about what art is and why it matters. And there are plenty of people who are doing that today. You don't find it, you won't see it reviewed in the New York Times, and you go to the Chelsea galleries or the Bushwick galleries, you're unlikely to see that kind of art. But there are plenty of people who are seriously dedicating themselves to learning from the old masters. And I think that's a very profitable thing to do.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of beautiful art being created still. Yes. Well, that is all we have time for this evening. So thank you, Mr. Kimball, for joining us and sharing your thoughts.
Yep, yeah. Thank you. And good luck with the King's College.
Thank you so much. I just want to give everyone a few more details before we end. First, the next few days are packed full of competitions. The full schedule is available on our website, tkcinterregnum.com. You can find every detail you should need to know there. And if you have any questions about that, please email us interregnum@tkc.edu. Finally, we will be sending the Google form in the chat in just a moment, and you just need to fill that out to make sure you have credit for this evening's event. Other than that, that is everything. So thank you all for coming tonight, and we look forward to seeing you on campus soon.